Well, welcome everyone. Having a good Wild West Hackin Fest so far? Yeah. Back in Deadwood for the first time in several years. It's good to be back. A little chilly, but fun stuff. Alrighty, well, we're going to talk today a little bit about vulnerabilities. I know, blah, vulnerabilities. Okay, we find them, we exploit them, shells rain down from the skies, and we feel like gods. That's the ideal. But on the other hand, we've got these dang fandangled tools called vulnerability scanners, and they do throw a little bit of a wrinkle in our idealized circumstance. And it turns out that to me, particularly, vulnerabilities are my bread and butter. I'm the SAND instructor who's the author of the vulnerability assessment course inside of SAND, and I've worked as a penetration tester for Black Hills, for CounterHack, and then I even started up my own firm called Open Security, and we do pen test, vulnerability assessment, all of that jazz. But at the end of the day, what we're focused on is identifying issues within organizations and then fixing the ones, hopefully the ones that matter. And this is really where things start to take a turn for the worse. Does anyone know how many CVEs have been released this year? Here's a hint. Just get within 10,000 and it probably still counts. This year, we're already over CVE 2022, 40 freaking thousand. 40,000, holy crap. And yes, not every single identifier actually ends up getting issued as a CVE. They do get held for some reasons, many different reasons. Maybe they don't even get issued, or maybe they're held for a short period of time. So recognize it's not technically 40,000, but we're still around 30,000 CVEs in 2022. What attacker, what adversary on the planet every single year spends their time learning 40,000 plus new techniques? I mean, we're only in October. Yeah, nobody, right? Nobody. And so it turns out that the vast majority of vulnerabilities will never matter to anyone for any reason ever, period. But your vulnerability scanner will tell you. It'll certainly tell you. And you'll see a CVSS score. And that CVSS score might be an 8.5. Ooh, bad. Oh, wait, it's a TLS vulnerability. Nobody cares. It's a TLS vulnerability. TLS, it's encrypted. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it ugly? Nobody cares because we don't get a shell from exploiting a TLS vulnerability. Unless it's Heartbleed, which isn't technically a TLS vulnerability. But there are, of course, other circumstances that might arise. But at the end of the day, if you scan a system right now that is TLS 1.0 fully patched, your vulnerability scanner will call it an issue. And the reason why is because TLS 1.0 is no longer supported. But it is also not vulnerable to any condition that we are currently aware of today. Which means if you spend remediation time fixing that issue, you have fixed something that nobody cares about at all. With one exception, compliance. And everybody said, oh, compliance, yes. So there is, of course, organizational risk, right? And that, by and large, is an attacker's gonna hack in, maybe they're gonna throw some ransomware around, and now we're ASUS paying $40 million in ransom straight to our evil or something. True story, that happened last year. ASUS, $40 million. The damages, much in excess of that, but the direct Bitcoin payment for a single compromise there, $40 million. Did those attackers do that via TLS? No. Do they even pay attention when a new TLS finding comes out? No, they don't care about it at all. And so what's really interesting about the vulnerability conversation is that vulnerabilities do matter. They absolutely do, but only some of them. And in fact, less than 0.01% of them. So what's our vulnerability scanner doing to give us the tools we need to spend the time on the things that matter? This has been a pretty big issue. And I was talking to a friend of mine named John. Say hi, John. John, he's in the audience here, in fact. So I was in London several months ago, and I had a conversation with John, and we started talking about vulnerabilities and vulnerability scanners and open source versus proprietary. And one of the biggest issues that we really have in vulnerability discovery today is that we have very little control as the InfoSec practitioners of our vulnerability data, as in Nexpose from Rapid7, Nessus from Tenable, Qualys from Qualys, and that's it, right? Yes, there are other vulnerability scanners out there, but those are the big three. They very nearly have a monopoly inside of the space. And John's like, he's getting irate about this. Hey, this isn't cool. Those are proprietary vulnerability data sets. We can't do anything with that stuff. Open source should have an option to. And I'm saying, preach, buddy, preach. Sing it from the mountains, sing it down in the valley. Absolutely. We as practitioners need to be able to control our vulnerability data so that we can decide what matters inside of our environments. And John cues me into a number of different projects that are out there for this. And you're familiar with Nmap scripting engine? No, nobody knows about Nmap? Oh my gosh. Yeah, Nmap scripting engine, right? Well, NSE is cool, I guess. There's some pros to NSE and there's some cons, but right now, it's not something that you can just swap out with, say, an enterprise level vulnerability scanning tool like Nessus Professional, for example. However, that's a lot to do with some of the underlying issues with how open source has been working around vulnerability data. For example, does anyone know what tool happens to have the most, by far, exploits in it on the planet? Any idea? Shout it out. Metasploit, absolutely, Metasploit. Metasploit's also open source, and it's built by the open source community. There are closed source exploitation tools. Not Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike's an operations toolkit, but you have things like Core Impact or Immunity. Those are both tools that the developers make their own exploits for known vulnerabilities, and they sell that to penetration testers. Those frameworks have almost no vulnerabilities in them, not next to Metasploit. So we know that the open source community can do this. We know that. And Nmap scripting engine is an example of us trying to do this. And one of the issues that we've got with NSE is that if you go out and you make yourself an Nmap scripting engine script to find some vulnerability, well, how do you get that into the Nmap project? Good question. I'm not going to give you an answer to that question because the point is, good question. Yeah, so if you're using Nmap scripting engine and you really want to make it powerful, what you actually have to do is you have to Google a bunch. Find people's GitHub repositories where they've made their own NSE script for, insert vulnerability of the day here and there and everywhere. And you bring them in and you add them to your script DB locally. And this is a lot of work. What if you missed a Google? What if you didn't get all of these scripts? Now suddenly you have a tool with a lot of holes in it. And this is one of the biggest foundational issues with Nmap scripting engine. I know a lot of people think, oh yeah, it's maybe slow or there's some other issue going on. But the real issue is that there's not been a big body of support for maintaining a library of these scripts that we can then share and use. But it turns out that some of this has begun to change. For example, in the case of Nmap scripting engine, you can look at something like Scanning Made Easy by NCSC, that is the United Kingdom government. And so we're actually seeing governments start to back some of these open source projects, which is very, very exciting. And that's super cool. So John says this and also mentions, hey, you might want to take a look at my talk. You should take a look at John's talk. It's absolutely fantastic. He talks about some of these things like Scanning Made Easy and writing your own Nmap scripting engine scripts, all of this stuff. So highly recommend. YouTube link is on the slide right there. I'll also be posting the slides in the Discord channel right after this. So if you can't see that, no worries. My eyes aren't the best either. I had surgery on them twice and I still need glasses, but I will post the slides in the Discord. And then after this, I of course say, the means of production belong in the hands of the working class. And by which I mean the means of vulnerability discovery belong in the hands of the hacking class. Revolution, communism, baby, in vulnerability assessment. Let's go. I might have been paraphrasing this conversation here. I'm not sure that John is all in on the revolution, but I am. All right. Here's an example of one of those projects. This is the Scanning Made Easy project by NCSC. And so they've got some guidance and guidelines on how to make an Nmap scripting engine module according to their guidance, and then information on how to contribute it to their project. There are some pros and cons around this whole thing. A, you've got a government that's backing this. That's pretty cool. B, you do have some kind of guidelines, but then there's a downside. They kind of did this and forgot about a lot of what they were doing. And so while here you see a scripting engine script that is included in NCSC, they didn't really keep up with this, even though they kind of made it this year. So yeah, we're still baby steps. We're still in baby steps. But if you find yourself making an Nmap scripting engine module, you now have a vector to get that into the hands of people who perhaps need it. Maybe you needed that Nmap scripting engine module for yourself, but you want to share it after the fact. Here is a place where you can drop that, send a pull request out to them, and share it with the community at large. That's pretty darn cool. That's pretty darn cool. Alrighty. But they're not the only government organization that has made a lot of play for us in the vulnerability discovery, identification, risk calculation space. Because if almost all vulnerabilities don't matter at all, what do we care about? Just the ones that do, right? Doesn't matter if you're a vulnerability tester or a penetration tester, you care about the vulnerabilities that matter. And are there mechanisms that we can leverage in order to identify which ones we should care about versus which ones we can maybe tolerate inside of our environment? This is particularly true for penetration testers. For example, I also teach the penetration testing course with SANS. And one of the things that I find really, really cool whenever I'm teaching brand new penetration testers is they get this idea in their head. I'm going to find some vulnerabilities and then I'm going to exploit some vulnerabilities. And what that means is I'm going to scan maybe with Nessus and then I'm going to open up Metasploit and I'm going to search through Metasploit to find the exploit module for that CVE identifier. Now, anybody here done that? I'll put myself down. I did that too. Absolutely. Everybody who's learned pen test for the first time does this and then realizes there's not an exploit module for like 90% of the things that come out as a finding. A, because maybe the vulnerability didn't matter, or B, because nobody wrote an exploit module for it at all. And if I'm a penetration tester, I want to get shells, get access, move laterally, dump passwords, crack passwords, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's a vulnerability that comes out as remote code execution out of my scanner, well, that seems like it's going to be shells for me, right? But if there's no Metasploit module for that, I can't really use it unless I wrote my own exploit from scratch, and nobody really does that, especially not in the pen test world. Who does? Do cyber criminals write their own exploits from scratch? Technically, yes, but almost never do they do this either. And this is something we don't really understand very well as information security practitioners. We think cyber criminals gonna do crimes. Here's a vulnerability that could give them the stuff, and they could get, say, $40 million from ASUS if they exploited that. Is writing an exploit worth $40 million to them? Yeah, probably. This makes sense, right? Except here's the thing. ASUS is one company. And there happen to be, I don't know, let me check my notes, thousands of companies out there, right? Thousands and thousands of companies. And so if I'm spending a lot of time developing exploit code so I can get into this one specific target, well, that's not billable hours for me. See, cyber criminals are also billing hours. They just have a lot higher risk, extradition, jail time, you name it, which means they want a lot higher salary. I'm not making minimum wage and doing felonies over here, bro. No, I'm going to get 10K per hour. Absolutely. And if we're talking about these major ransomware engagements like Colonial Pipeline, Kaseya, et cetera, we're talking about ransomware that's in the order of millions and millions of dollars. And so all that I'm doing, if I spend time making my toolkit better as a cyber criminal, is I am decreasing my billable hours unless the thing that I made is going to make me so much more efficient that I can recoup that on the back end, which means cyber criminals very, very, very rarely develop. If they can at all help it, they won't. Moreover, if we're talking about exploit development, particularly in modern Windows systems like, say, Windows 10 and all the stack-based protection, safe SCH, ASLR, data execution protection, the list goes on, ROP gadget chains galore to pull it off. That's a high level of capability to be able to pull that off too. And I want to have easy mode with lots of cache. That makes a lot of sense. Who does make exploits? Nation states do. So if your organization has, say, foreign nation states or local nation states inside of its threat model, this may, of course, change. For example, one of the things that the National Security Agency did a lot of while I was there is we'd have down days. And during those down days, what you would do is you'd basically make exploits that are not known for vulnerabilities that are known. But you wouldn't use those to go after any real target. What you would do is you'd use those to develop infrastructure. So infrastructure that you use to launch attacks on other targets. So even nation states are kind of treading around the edges of these as opposed to doing just direct exploitation, unless we're talking 0 day. Because if we're talking about a nation state, why would they waste a lot of time developing their own exploit code for a really hard to exploit vulnerability and spending all of that high level of capability when you could just patch it because it's known? So even nation states don't really want to deal with those kind of vulnerabilities. It's okay for us to have, say, an RCE that we've discovered, and as a penetration tester say, I can't exploit that, I'm going to move on. That's okay, that is standard. But what is exploitable? That's a better question. And CISA, I hate this acronym, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, use the word security twice in 4 letters. What gives? Jeez, take TLR's 101, 3-letter acronyms, TLAs, excuse me. And it's 4, which makes it even worse. But these guys have been doing a great job. So Jen Easterly, Yes, I believe that's right. She runs CISA, and she's been doing absolutely fantastic work. And not just for critical infrastructure, but they've also been releasing this kind of information and their research to the information security community as a whole as well. And that's absolutely fantastic. One of the things that's been a bit groundbreaking this year is the known exploited vulnerabilities list, the KEVs. So essentially what they're doing is they're tracking exploitation of conditions in the wild. And their catalog, this little JSON catalog you'll see here on the right-hand side, their catalog tracks all of the vulnerabilities that they've seen real adversaries exploit in the wild. Which means if my scanner finds me a vulnerability and that vulnerability has a KVE associated with it, suddenly I might know what matters. And whereas you might have 30,000 new CVEs come out any given year, the KEV list right now, don't quote me on the exact number because it's constantly getting updated. They've been, unlike NCSC, they have been on this project on a daily basis, like on a daily basis. But it's a little bit over 1,000. I think it might be like 1,500 or so. Again, don't quote me on that because my number might be a little off. But the point is, 30,000 in 1 year versus say 1,500 overarchingly, that is a huge ability to identify specifics about what may matter for your organization and what comes out of, say, a vulnerability scanner. This kind of information is what we call vulnerability intelligence. And your general purpose vulnerability scanners do actually provide a little bit of this. Anyone ever scan with Nexpose and it says, hey, there's a Metasploit module for this vulnerability? Yeah, it'll do that. It'll say, hey, there's an exploit database module for it, or there's a Metasploit module for it. It might actually link to the place in the project where that actually exists. And so if I'm a penetration tester, this is actually paid information from my scanner, right? I don't want to know about what TLS findings there are. I want to know what vulnerabilities exist where I've got a module that can get me some shells for them. This is pretty useful information. It's vulnerability intelligence. But there's a lot more than just, is it in Metasploit? There's a lot more than is it just in Metasploit. In fact, if we're talking about any kind of web bug, it's probably not in Metasploit, but you can probably pull off the exploit anyways on your own because it's a web bug. Maybe there's a blog post on it or whatnot. And if adversaries are doing this real world, we probably want to have that same level of capability too. We don't need to know everything, but we need to know enough to be the same level as the threats that we are trying to protect organizations from. And the KEVs are great at this. Well, it turns out there's more. As a community, we're also pretty good at discussing vulnerabilities and determining how bad they are. Sometimes we're not so good. Sometimes it's pretty okay though. Take, for example, Log4j. Anyone remember Log4j? Yeah, December surprise. If you think that you're going to have Christmas break this year, think again, right? Last year, Log4j, year before that, SolarWinds, baby. Oh yes, December every year. That's InfoSec. What you should have done is gone to the other talk in track 2 that says, why am I leaving InfoSec and why you should too. That's basically the title of that talk. Cool. But instead, you're stuck with me. Oh no. But so when Log4j came out, everyone said this vulnerability is going to be really, really bad, right? According to CISA, oh, they're not on the slide anymore. According to CISA, it's the worst vulnerability in the history of computing. Well, how many serious ransomwares have we seen this year due to Log4j? Not very many, right? In January, we did see a few. There was a ransomware group out of China called Night Sky, but they were ransomwaring organizations for about 800K. And I know, that seems like a lot of money, but it's not. It's not. 40 million at ASUS, 800K. Oh, that's baby ransomware. Yeah, I know, it's kind of disgusting to say that, but it is true. The thing about it, though, is you could technically have identified that Log4j wasn't going to be the biggest of deals right off the bat, because it normally will affect systems, at least from a remote exploitation perspective, systems that have web servers on them. Now, of course, Log4j is not related to web servers specifically at all, but if we're talking about systems that attackers will actually be able to get access to remotely over the network, we are probably talking about a Java-based web application, by and large. Well, these Java-based web applications, probably running, say, a Tomcat web server on a Windows system, do you think? No, probably on a Unix system, right? On maybe a Linux server, call it Ubuntu or Fedora, whatever it might be. Are those typically connected to Windows Active Directory? No. Because it turns out that one of the bigger issues here, next slide. Yeah, one of the bigger issues here is things like lateral exposure. So if we're going through and we're trying to figure out what makes a vulnerability matter to us, it might be more than just that vulnerability itself. It might be, what does this unlock for you? Anyone here use a tool called Bloodhound? Yeah, Bloodhound's pretty awesome. Bloodhound will do attack path mapping, particularly around trust relationships in Windows Active Directory. So for example, let's say you have one Windows Active Directory user, maybe somebody clicked the phishing link. What Bloodhound will do is say, hey, with this user, you could go along all of these different paths and then eventually make it to domain admin, but you have to follow these paths, which means it tells us exactly what system perhaps we want to exploit next, because that system has maybe a user who's logged in, who also is in a Windows Active Directory group that another domain admin is in as well, but has system privileges on some device in the environment. The list goes on, but that kind of idea, right? Where one condition leads to higher levels of lateral exposure as a result of them as well. And one of the things that we could see with Log4j is that the lateral exposure potential was really, really low. For example, compare Log4j with Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue, we've got Petya, we've got WannaCry. Oh, and by the way, if we're talking CVSS scores, same. In fact, the CVSS score for Log4j is higher than Eternal Blue. Yeah, I know, riddle that one. Yeah, that's crazy though. Merck this year just closed their court case for WannaCry, and they got their insurance vendor to actually pay out. This was in February of this year, and they paid out $1.2 billion in damages. That is one organization exploited due to one specific condition, 1.2 billion. That's not some 800,000 itty bitty ransomware over there, is it? Yeah. So what we can identify is that some vulnerabilities matter, and there are a number of things that make them worse or better for us. But if we had our own vulnerability data set where we could take these kinds of information pieces and put them into that data set, suddenly we have a lot more potential. For example, when Log4j came out, a lot of the communication around that CVE was on Twitter or other sources as well. And there's this tool called CVE Trends that will trend all of these things. It'll show blog posts, Twitter posts, communication and conversations with information security professionals, all of that jazz. This is vulnerability intelligence, absolutely is. CVE Puller is a command line tool that you can use to grab that information down. Can you put this information, KEVs, CVE Trends, internal identification of potential lateral exposure for something like Log4j that you've done for your organization itself. Can you add that to the Nexpose database? No, you can't. Will you ever be able to do that? Probably not. They don't have an incentive to do this whatsoever. A, they have a soft monopoly between the three vendors because you can't do it for any of them. And B, they don't really care. It's not like you can go somewhere else and get it. Or can you? Maybe that's the point of this talk. Alrighty. So the thing is, again, most vulnerabilities never matter to anyone ever. What matters to us is why we care about a condition, and can we take that why and add it to our own vulnerability data sets so we can get more efficient results back? And the answer is absolutely yes. But the first thing that we've got to start with is a vulnerability database. And this is the first place that as a vulnerability scanner, Nmap scripting engine really starts to fall to pieces. Because Nmap scripting engine doesn't have a vulnerability database. It has a scanning library, and each one of those scanning, say, scanners, a Lua script, if you will find a vulnerability condition. It will. But it doesn't do the whole check what version of software that system is, and then let's check to see in our database of all vulnerabilities if that version of software is affected by any of them. This is what your general purpose scanners do. Rapid7. In fact, Rapid7 is kind of funny because the way Nexpose works is Nexpose runs Nmap. I'm not kidding. It runs Nmap. If you install Nexpose on a Windows device, it will create a folder called Nmap in your program files folder because that's what it's doing. It's running Nmap. And then it takes the results from Nmap because Nmap can do version scanning. And then it takes that version information and it checks in this database to see if it has any results. This is what we call vulnerability correlation. That's literally what Rapid7, a publicly traded company, does. Wow, nice. We could do that too, because it turns out that the vulnerability data set that even they use is publicly available. We could get all of this information from NVD, that's the National Vulnerability Database, and there's some pretty cool details that we'll see in here. Things about the different CVEs. Here you can see a CVE that I pulled like a week ago or so, and the CVE is like 39,000 or something, because we're in October and lots of vulnerabilities are coming out all the time. And then here you can also see that it's calculated the CVSS score. This is also particularly interesting. Anyone here like CVSS? The way I asked that question made nobody raise their hand. Anyone here hate CVSS? It was a trick question. I got you either way. If we look at the CVSS score here, what you'll notice is it's actually calculating it inside of the vulnerability data set itself. And if we go to a CVSS calculator like this, we can see that in action. But wait, This said base calculation. And it looks to me like there's 3 different subsets of CVSS. It's actually a really important thing to recognize about CVSS. A lot of folks think that CVSS is bad because it doesn't apply to your environment, right? Just because you got a vulnerability in one place doesn't mean that the same level of risk exists if that same vulnerability is on a critical asset. But the thing is, CVSS does have the ability to do this. It's got environmental considerations and even time-based ones, temporal considerations as well, to then deliver an overall score. The problem is that your automated tooling will not do this. They will absolutely not finish CVSS. It's like you go to a math exam and you finish the first third and say, give me an A, please. No, you're not getting an A. That's a 33%. Are you kidding me? Can we finish the calculation? Yes, we can. Can we then adjust that inside of a proprietary vulnerability database? No, we can't. Which means even more reasons for us to perhaps have that unlocked wholesale. And so penetration testers, as a result of all of these things, really kind of by and large hate vulnerability scanners because it's giving us a lot of junk information. A lot of the stuff just doesn't apply. We want to find vulnerabilities, we want to exploit those vulnerabilities, we want to find more vulnerabilities, and we want to get those shells. That's what we're here for, right? I didn't become a pen tester because I wanted to write a report. I became a pen tester because I wanted to hack some systems, man. Yeah. But does the scanner really focus on providing us that? And at the end of the day, the scanners are not designed for pen testers. So if you were to design a scanner for a penetration tester, what kind of features and focus areas would you perhaps give it? For example, what about privilege escalation opportunities? Let's say we're doing an agent-based scan. So maybe we can do a network scan. We can also do agent-based scans. Let's say we're doing an agent-based scan, which means they're local to the system itself. Can we check that system to see how it's been configured? 100% we can. 100% we can. We can even use something like Power Up. Power Up is what it's called. That's a PowerShell script that'll look for misconfigurations on the local system that might lead you to the ability to gain, say, privilege escalation. If I'm a penetration tester and I'm a local user, I definitely want to do that privilege escalation thing because now I can run Mimikatz. Now I can get myself hashes, we can crack those, etc. If this system allows for privilege escalation through, let's say, DLL preloading, right? That's a bad condition. Don't want to have that happen. If it is set up that way, is that a vulnerability? It is. It absolutely is. Will your general purpose vulnerability scanners report this vulnerability? No, because it's a feature. It's a feature. Windows was designed to be insecure. Sorry to say. Actually, I'm happy to say that's job security. It's job security, absolutely. But could our scanner do this? Yes. Does our scanner need to be able to do this before we grab it and start using it? Well, no. What if it's extensible? Could I push Power Up through my scanning agent? Well, not if we're talking about an expose, but theoretically we could, right? Theoretically, we absolutely could. Theoretically, the vulnerability scanning agent could be the best pen test implant that you could possibly hope for. What else can we do? What about password auditing? This is a very interesting one. A lot of vulnerability assessors don't do password auditing at all. They say password cracking is for pen testers. Well, here's the thing. Does every pen test end up with domain admin? No. Hopefully the pen test didn't end up with domain admin because maybe the organization's a little bit secure. So hopefully the pen test doesn't end up with domain admin. If it doesn't end up with domain admin, who's cracking the passwords and checking to see if they're really bad? Nobody is. Nobody is, right? But vulnerability assessors, on the other hand, they by design will likely have access to these systems because they're not trying to hack into them to actualize and demonstrate risk. They're just looking for vulnerabilities in general. So password auditing is absolutely part and parcel to vulnerability scanning and vulnerability assessment. If we've already done that from a vulnerability scanning perspective, do we want to know that information as pen testers? Absolutely. Absolutely we do. Why not? What about hardening details? This one's even more interesting. Your scanners will definitely not look for this kind of stuff because they're not flaws, but they do make the system a lot harder to hack your way through. Let's say, for example, I'm in an organization and I'm doing a penetration test and they are using CrowdStrike. Now, can you bypass CrowdStrike? For sure. Absolutely you can. But the easiest way to get around CrowdStrike is to find some place where it's not, because CrowdStrike's actually rather good. I'm not a big fan of most EDR products. Like SentinelOne, I can go on for eons and eons about how much I hate them and their marketing team, but CrowdStrike's actually pretty decent. Can we look for systems where that isn't in play? And will we call those high value targets for us as penetration testers? Absolutely, we could do those kinds of things too. On the other hand, flip that. If you're a vulnerability assessor, do you want to know where in your environment you have soft targets? Yeah, probably. We can do a lot with this kind of access from the perspective of vulnerability discovery. The world is our oyster. but a proprietary vendor is just not. So if it's more open, we have the ability to decide what's right for us. So let's see where the rubber meets the road. Let's actually go to town on this. So I was having another conversation with a colleague of mine named Mick Douglas. He's not here, actually. He just got out of brain surgery. He's doing really well, so good for him. And he was asking me, he was doing this really big project to identify open source tooling. And he was asking me, hey, Matt, do you know any really solid open source vulnerability scanners? And my response, this was like 4 or 5 months ago, was, yes, I'm making one. That's the response that any developer will give you when they're making a tool. Yeah. But then at the end of the conversation, he asked me something that's really interesting. He says, how can I help? And that's really cool about the open source community. Because at the end of the day, we suck at capitalism. We absolutely suck at capitalism, but we do work right as a community together. And in the case of the tool that I'm going to start showing off here, that also is very true. So I wrote some of this, but I didn't write all of this. For example, we want to take data from the National Vulnerability Database and programmatically be able to use it to maybe give ourselves, let's say, a vulnerability API that we can query, that we can add stuff to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you'd have to kind of understand all of this NVD data, right? But I didn't have to write that because somebody else did, specifically Pandatics, which is Lucas Florian Toussain. Yeah, that's how you pronounce his name, Toussain. He built this, and I was on Twitter, and I was complaining, oh my gosh, I have to build all these things. Anyone have a good tool for this? And he's like, hey, I wrote that a while ago. You should use this. Guess what? The engine for understanding NVD, completely written by him. And that's because the open source community, we play together really, really well. And in this case, that worked out very nicely. All righty. So first off, let's go ahead and do a journey, if you will, down the path of vulnerability discovery with a focus of building ourselves a vulnerability database that can give us all of that value that we've been talking about so far. So first off, we need to get the information from NVD and understand it. See that there? And now we want to be able to push that information into some kind of vulnerability API. And we can do that with any language on the planet. In this case, we're using Go. Go is actually really nifty. It's fast. It's just really fast. Anyone here program stuff in Python? Yeah, I'm a fan of Python as well. I've done some malware in Python, let's say. And building a C2 server in Python is always really aggravating because it's slow. Like, it doesn't feel like it's all that slow. And normally we're talking about scripting. That kind of efficiency doesn't really matter that much. But if you've got 100 agents across a pen test, like you're getting a huge environment and you've got 100 agents implanted, suddenly your API queries that the agent, the callbacks from the agents are actually really slow and it gets clunky, and suddenly your tooling starts to slow down over time. Take Cobalt Strike as an example of this. Anyone used Cobalt Strike before? Cobalt Strike's a wonderful tool, heavily used by red teamers, but if you ever try to put 1,000 implants across an environment with Cobalt Strike, that sucker is going to fall on its face. Absolutely will. In the case of vulnerability data, we have a need to deal with even more data. Because the idea is we might even put it across the entire environment. We might be running a scan that sends a huge amount of stuff to this. Heck, if we were trying to take NVD and shove 40,000 CVEs from this year alone into it to build our vulnerability database, well, it needs to be a little bit robust and able to handle that. And it turns out that the Go Gin API system can do this in milliseconds. I was shocked by how fast this was. I literally shoved 10 years worth of vulnerability data into it, got up to get myself a cup of coffee because I figured this was going to be a while. And then by the time I stood up, I looked over, it was done. It was done. Like microseconds for each individual request. Super duper cool. And so here we're just going to use Go as our tool of choice for this, just because it's pretty easy to make API requests. Here's an API request right there. And it's super duper fast when we're dealing with large amounts of data. All right, so now we've done a little bit of creating ourselves a vulnerability database, but we're not done yet, right? We want to take all of our vulnerability intelligence and enrich it inside of that data set itself. And we can absolutely do that with something like this too. Now, instead of just pushing a whole vulnerability, we're just going to push an add-on, an addition to that vulnerability, that individual vulnerability, if you will. Now, I do want to mention one thing here real quickly. When we're talking about vulnerability databases, we are not talking about vulnerability data. You see, what if I work for a company like Black Hills, and we've got, say, 30 to 50 penetration testers? If I, as a pen tester for Black Hills, happen to find a vulnerability that was pay dirt, and like 3 pen tests in a row is just money, money, money. That's kind of vulnerability intelligence, and I could put that in my data set. But at the same time, I already personally kind of know this because I've been using it for a while. But can I take my discovery and allow the rest of the team to also benefit from that as well? And the answer, of course, is yes. But this gets a little bit iffy in a lot of folks' mind because we think about this, wait, you don't want to reuse your vulnerability data from one engagement to another engagement because now we're polluting from one client to perhaps another client, right? And that's why I want to drive a distinction between vulnerability data and the vulnerability database. Vulnerability data is about the engagement that you've just performed, whereas the vulnerability database is what you're going to query when you get a finding or when you find some system, right? All right. And so we can absolutely do that with this. How hard or easy is it to do? Well, let's take a look at some of this here real quickly together. Let's say I wanted to make an API request. This is a tool called Postman, really useful for just making easy API requests. We can also do this in curl. In fact, Postman will show you the curl command for this as well. So if you wanted to do this in curl, straight from the command line, Postman will in fact show you that. The Postman documentation for the entire API that we're going through is also fully available online too, so you get all of this. But here, if I want to look for a CVE, all I do is say CVE, specify the CVE, and then send, boom, and now you get, as a response back, all of that CVE data. Let's look at it on the command line real quick with perhaps curl, because everybody likes command line. Like so, and there you have it. Here we have essentially an endpoint that we're able to query to interact with our vulnerability data. In this case, we're just getting a finding. But there's many more things that we could, of course, do, like, let's say, enrich that data with a key. So let's say I wanted to update that vulnerability with more information. So here you see that finding that we just pulled back, that vulnerability. I can add or change anything here. This is a template. That's all this is. This is a template for what a vulnerability looks like in NVD, which is the same spec that is followed by this tool. And so in that case, let's say that I wanted to add to this something like a KEV, a little hard to see. Here I'm adding some tags, KEV and Metasploit, all that kind of stuff. If I submit this, booyah, we have just updated our vulnerability data set. And now if we went back and tried to get the finding again, the new information would in fact be there as well. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. But how does this really help us find vulnerabilities inside of our environment? Well, let's take a look at something called Common Platform Enumeration, CPEs. So we talk about CVEs all the time, common vulnerabilities and exposures, but CPEs is another specification that kind of goes alongside it. In fact, I didn't really quite mention this, but you might notice that inside of our vulnerability data that we got from NVD again, right? It's specifying the CPE for that vulnerability. The way that CPEs work is it is an enumeration standard for software. Technically, you can find out if you're vulnerable without ever scanning at all. All you've got to do is know everything that you have, put it in a format like this, query it, boom, you're good to go. That's pretty interesting. That's really interesting. It's kind of a know thy enemy, know thyself kind of story, right? If you know all about your environment, you know more about your environment than the attacker knows about your environment, you can leverage that to identify the vulnerabilities that maybe exist there. And it's quite easy to make CPEs. Essentially here we've got the CPE. This is the version. They're in version 2.3 with well-formed names, WFNs. That's not particularly important. The platform here, so in this case it's Microsoft, and then Internet Explorer, the version of Internet Explorer, and then perhaps whatever update it might be, and the list goes on with additional information as well. So this is most of what you'll actually use. So those are CPEs. This means if we can collect information about a piece of software inside of our environment or on one of our systems, we could then query our vulnerability database, and we will get a list of all the CVEs that happen to have that CPE associated with it. Okay, let's do this. Let's do this manually real quick. So first off, we need to add a host as well, because so far we've only been working on vulnerability data. But if we want to actualize this, right, if we want to make it actionable, we want to find vulnerabilities, not just have the ability to ask questions about vulnerabilities, right? So now we want to include the target as part of this conversation. So let's add a host. Here's just basic information about a Windows system. Doesn't have to be particularly expressive. If you wanted to, you could add CPEs like you see here directly into the host in line with that, but you don't have to do that. You definitely don't have to do that. So next, let's go look for CPEs. In this case, we might just go to installed Windows software. Well, it's Microsoft, it's on Windows. Here we see Google Chrome, the update version of Google Chrome. We have just crafted a CPE for Google Chrome, and now we can query that. Here's a curl request, just like we did before, querying for that CPE, or sorry, in this case, adding the CPE to that host. And now if we query the host, we're gonna get all the vulnerabilities, all the CVEs that are associated with it because of the CPE we just added. That's pretty cool, but this is also tedious, right? How much software you have installed on any given system, and if you've got thousands of systems, there ain't no way that you're gonna be able to pull this off. But we kind of see the process going now, right? How can we automate this? What if we had an agent that's on the local system? If that agent is on the local system, does it have access to all of that information that is required to be able to craft a CPE? Absolutely it does. In fact, the Windows registry makes it stupendously easy. You go to the Windows registry and it gives you all the information about installed file path, the version of the software, the update client, like it's all there. And I don't even just mean for Microsoft software. The way that Windows has programs install themselves onto Windows due to how MSIs work will make all that information available in the Windows registry. Now, are there other places you could look for to craft CPEs as well? Yes, for example, if you install Google Chrome on Windows as a non-admin user, it'll install itself into app data, and technically that might actually fluster the tool. But what that means is there are edge cases. So recognize to every solution, there are also issues. And this is not something that's just unique to this open source tool. See, a lot of people think, hey, we do credential scanning. We do agent-based scanning. We don't do the network scanning stuff anymore. We have graduated. Agent scanning is better. It's actually not true. You see, that little use case I just gave about how an agent might miss a CPE is exactly what happens when you do agent-based scanning or authenticated scanning with Rapid7 or Tenable. Absolutely, it happens. False negatives in authenticated scanning are very common. People always think, oh yeah, we're gonna have fewer false positives and fewer false negatives if we do authenticated scanning. Lies. That is not true. You will, generally speaking, get fewer false positives, but you're gonna get them in a completely different way because you're doing a completely different style of test. And in the case of false negatives, you may actually end up with a lot more, especially if you're doing credentialed scanning against a Linux system, because there are so many ways to install software on a Linux device. So downsides, but recognize that this is a downside that's shared between any agent-based scanning utility out there. Another interesting thing is most EDR products, or not most, but a lot of EDR products have also started including some kind of agent-based vulnerability detection system into the EDR product itself. So if you look at CrowdStrike, for example, CrowdStrike has a vulnerability scanner from its agent as well, which is pretty darn cool. And in my opinion, a lot of the EDR ones are doing a better job than Rapid7 or Tenable or Qualys. And I'm very excited to see what that future looks like. But in this case here, we also have the ability to do that. And so now if we've installed this agent on systems, we're able to craft CPEs manually. We haven't sent a single packet for scanning out at all, but we have a lot of vulnerability data directly that came back. And that vulnerability data has been enriched to our heart's content on whatever it is that we'd like to have used as a data source for that. Maybe the KEV catalog as an example. And here's an example of what the agent actually looks like. So here it's executing a task specifically. This is me saying the quiet part out loud because I'm sorry, folks. I'm a red teamer. I'm a pen tester. I couldn't help myself. Yes, I installed a terminal into the agent itself. You can execute commands too. Cool. So that's all fabulous. That's well and good. We're getting some vulnerability data now. But what about scanning the system itself? Well, this is all command line gross stuff so far, right? Guess what? Who wants that? Let's wrap something really snazzy and pretty around it. And here you've got a tool called Sirius. And as of today, Sirius is going into alpha. It's open source, publicly available, and free, but alpha. Here's an example of why it's an alpha. This is ghetto and bad, and I should feel bad, but it works for now. How many of those words do you reckon I wrote in my own comment there? I was using something called GitHub Copilot. And so I'm going here to write myself a comment to remember to go back and fix this. And I write, this is ghetto, and Copilot auto-completes it to, and bad, and I should feel bad. What are you doing? Are you AI? Are you telling me something? And then it gives me another option to auto-complete it as like, oh, you know, but it's okay. But it works for now. I found that to be pretty fun. Also, we have more ability as well. So in this case, Nmap scripting engine, we can integrate that to something like this to be a scanning on the network style utility as well. And we can do that. But instead of write it from scratch, there are other open source tools we can leverage as well. The Layer framework is an attack management system, and it has the ability to translate data from a huge number of vulnerability collection systems. Nexpose, Tenable, Nmap scripting engine, it'll do Recon NG, all of that kind of stuff, and these are all Go libraries. So we can import that directly into Sirius, and boom, suddenly that engine is now part of Sirius as well. So it's actually an engine of engines. And so here you see a curl request where you're pulling down information about a host, and you're getting a list of all of the vulnerabilities that affect that host based off of the Nmap scan that we've done, based off of the CPEs that have been crafted automatically by the agent and implemented into the tool as well. And so we've got a bit more of a holistic picture. And here's an example of an API request that you could do to do that manually instead of doing it via curl. But of course, it's got a GUI. You could use that too. Here's the GUI. Inside of the GUI, if we wanted to create a host and add a CPE to it manually, we can also do that natively, which is nice. And I did mention that it's got a terminal because I literally am incapable of writing an open source tool without putting a backdoor in it. I have problems. But this is actually a rather useful utility for penetration testing itself. And the Sirius project's actually been involved with a lot of people in the information security community. I was doing a lot of polls over the course of the summer on what do we need to have in a vulnerability scanning utility? What do we need as a community to be in there? And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of responses. And in many cases, I'd like implement that into the tool. And then next week, new question, let's talk about agents, et cetera. And that's going to continue forward. So if you want to be participatory in the project itself, say future work, there is a project on GitHub. It kind of focuses on some of the things that are improvements that will happen. These are all going to happen before the end of the year. These are improvements that should land around halfway through November and such. That are just additions to the tool itself. But if you want to contribute, you can absolutely do that by participating in that Twitter discussion to determine, hey, what should be in there? For example, one thing that I really didn't think about was, can we do vulnerability scanning off of an asset inventory? I don't like asset inventories, so why would I think about that, right? But somebody mentioned it needs to have the ability to identify vulnerabilities based on the asset inventory. And I'm like, that's a dumb idea. And then I think about it for a second. I'm like, if you could just import CSV and then get a huge list of vulnerabilities as a result of that, that's not bad. Especially if we're talking about an organization that's, say, maybe mid-cap, maybe they're around 40 million in revenue, and they have an IT team, but they do not have a security team. For those organizations, they don't really have a lot of options. They could buy Nessus, but that costs as much as buying a pen test, right? So why even buy the vulnerability scanner at that point? And if I'm a penetration tester and I test one of these environments, it is going to be a dumpster fire. I already know that. I would be very happy if A, I could leave something behind after I'm done so this doesn't happen again, or B, that maybe there was something available in the first place that they could have used too. Why not? And if you at any point want to contribute code, these are all of the repositories for the code itself, but you don't have to code to help with this project. Like seriously, the amount of ideas that I've gotten just from the community, I mean, again, hundreds of responses on Twitter alone, so please join. In any case though, I am being told to leave the stage. I think we might have a time for a little bit of questions, John.
Yeah, we might have a time for a question. Matt, that's great talk. Of course, I forgot to tell you in the intro, Matthew loves building things, and it's really super awesome. So anybody have a question for Matthew here in the room? Yes, sir. You got to yell it or come to the microphone. One of the two.
I'm sorry, I can't catch that.
Louder.
Yes. This is a really good question. The question's about, are there any plans to add, say, old school ping sweep discovery engines and such? I didn't really get a chance to talk too much about those things. By the way, I'm doing a tool shed on this tool. I know I didn't like demo the tool or anything like that. That's because I'm doing a tool shed tomorrow on it. We're doing a lot more active stuff with it. But Sirius itself is actually a vulnerability scanning engine. I haven't really shown that off at all. Showed it more as like Nmap scripting engine being the engine, but it is absolutely its own scanning engine. It turns out that there are a lot of ways to discover things about systems that we can use to craft CPEs that we probably should be doing, but that Nmap just straight up doesn't do. And so the engine itself absolutely is going to have its own discovery set of capabilities, not just ping sweeps, ARP cache sweeping, all kinds of stuff as well.
Good Matt, question. One question from the Discord, and that is, does this scan all types of assets?
Does it scan all types of assets? Yes, but I will throw some caveats on there. The agent will compile for all operating systems, but it only does the scanning successfully right now on Windows, just because I haven't written the Mac components and the Linux component just yet. But for the rest, absolutely, it'll scan all operating systems. Now, one other additional caveat on that, is the script database that it leverages is Nmap scripting engine baseline, right? That's why it's so important for people to contribute to things like the NCSC Scanning Made Easy project, because in Nmap scripting engine, we tend to have very, very good coverage of the vulnerabilities that just blow up your network. Like Nmap will not miss something, by and large, that has the potential to blow up your network. What if we see a lot of IoT systems or ICS systems? Will this scan those? Yes, but I wouldn't necessarily think that the module depth there is going to be equivalent to, say, a Rapid7, Nexpose, or Tenable.
There was one more question in the Discord. It just basically says SCAP scans, SCAP.
Did he just say SCAP?
Yes.
So I talked a little about CVEs and CPEs, right? They're technically part of a trifecta of protocols. So there's SCAP and CVEs and CPEs together combined, their powers made better, can go under SCAP. And SCAP actually has a bunch of utilities to interact with and do stuff with that data. The problem is, I think all the utilities suck. I hate it. I absolutely despise it. I want nothing to do with it. I'm not going to build the SCAP stuff, but I will accept a pull request for that.
Nice. SCAP. My bad. Okay. Anybody else in the room got a question? I know you're all hungry. There's one.
Out of curiosity, why not build a bolt on the green boat? Why start from scratch?
Greenbone is in, yeah, the fork from Nessus, right? Yeah. It's OpenVAS is Greenbone, right?
Why build your own tool instead of
Yeah. Because OpenVAS is really, really bad. OpenVAS is just, it's, okay, I got the clap for that, so I guess that was enough of an answer. Yeah, OpenVAS is just, it's a really unfortunate story because OpenVAS actually has pretty darn decent module depth, which is a problem for open source. And OpenVAS isn't, well, these days it's actually pretty bad there too, but traditionally OpenVAS isn't that bad there. Unfortunately, the tool, like if you want to scan more than 20 systems, have fun. So yeah, I'm very familiar with the tool. Unfortunately, it's just not right.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you, Matt Toussain, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you all for coming.